Christ. Boy, talk about an influence, huh? Jesus was the most influential person who has ever lived. There's nobody that comes to a second close. I mean, nobody. One of the essential practices that Jesus applied when he was in ministry was he was a disciple maker. He raised up others who would multiply his own ministry. I mean, Jesus not only taught them to go out and share grace and share truth as he did, but he also taught them to raise up other disciples. As he raised them up, he wanted them to raise others up, and the process has continued for 2,000 years. It's why we know Jesus. It's why churches are all over the landscape of America and around the world. Jesus has had an influence for 2,000 years. In a 3.5-year ministry. It is incredible. And the neat thing is Jesus isn't finished with his ministry. He continues to move forward. In fact, Jesus still calls disciples today. He's calling you to be his disciple. That's right. John chapter 17, 20 through 23. John chapter 10, verse 14 through 20. Matthew 28, verse 19 and 20. Jesus is still calling disciples. And when he says, come and follow me, what he means is come and be like me. And the disciples knew that in the first century. They knew that to be called by a rabbi meant that you wanted to be like that rabbi. And Jesus calls us to be like him, to multiply his influence in today's day and age. In John chapter 10, as Jesus is raising up these disciples, he made an interesting comparison to the relationship between him and those who follow him with a metaphor of a shepherd and his sheep. And he says in John chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. Later on in that same chapter, he says this. He says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And so today we're looking at this idea. If we're followers of Jesus, if we're disciples of Jesus, and that's what he calls us to be, then we're also like sheep following after a shepherd. So I couldn't think of a better passage to do this with than one of the most famous shepherd passages in all of the Bible, the one we find in the book of Psalms. So if you grab your Bibles, let's open them to Psalm chapter 23. Psalm 23, and let's just dive in and read the very first verse. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. Of course, this is a psalm of David, shepherd boy who would become king of Israel. And one of the things I want you to see in this very first chapter, the very first verse, is that it's a summary of the whole psalm. David declares who the good shepherd is, but then he also says that this good shepherd provides all of his needs. The rest of the verses of this chapter go into the specific details of what those needs are. And the first area the good shepherd provides, the first need, is our spiritual need. We started looking at that last week. We continue today. Look at the rest of verse 2. He leads me beside quiet waters. If you missed last week, as he leads me to the paths of, to the lush green valleys, make sure you go to our website and catch up with us, okay? You can do that later on today. He leads me beside quiet waters. Now, when you hear this, maybe you're like me. I picture something like this right here. We saw last week David didn't live by any of this stuff. He didn't live by anything that looked like that. No. Now, David, he lived next to the wilderness. He lived at a place like this. So what is David talking about when he says he leads me to still waters, quiet waters? Well, first thing we need to know is that quiet waters, that water is an essential for not only us, but for sheep as well. And they need to be led to drink at least twice a day so they can get their fill of water. If they don't get it, they'll get sick. They'll start dehydrating, and then you got dead sheep on your hands. So in a landscape like this, where would David find still waters? Well, there are occasional spring rains, but most of the time it's dry in the desert, and he might be able to find a spring here and there. But a lot of times they would go to a place like this, a wadi, W-A-D-I, a wadi. What is a wadi? Well, because there's not a lot of rain, it still does rain up in the mountains. And so because of the rock surfaces, the rain will often drain down the mountains and end up causing flooding at the base of the mountains. As this flooding occurs, it forms riverbeds. They call these wadis. And this is a wadi in southern Israel right here. It can rain in one place, And in a whole other place, miles away, where there's not a cloud in the sky, you can have floodwaters rush through a wadi and end up being very dangerous for people if they're in the wadi. So shepherds and their sheep have been drowned getting a drink from a wadi when the rushing floodwaters come through. So shepherds always had to make sure they stayed on one side of the wadi, the same side their sheep were on, so that if the waters began to flow, they would take a step back and call the sheep, and they would follow the shepherd. They have to follow safely the voice of the shepherd. You know, it reminds me about how in our lives we can have those thirsts. We can have those desires, and we want our thirsts quenched. And sometimes we'll go our own places to get them. We don't follow the words of the shepherd. We don't follow his voice. And in like manner, we end up hurting ourselves. We can get ourselves in places of danger. Proverbs 14:12 says there is a path that seems right to man, but its end leads to death. We need to make sure that we're listening to the voice of the Good Shepherd, Jesus, and that we're following his voice. Not only does he meet our spiritual needs, he meets our directional needs. Our directional needs. Look at the rest of verse 3. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Here is a picture of the hills in Negev. I want you to see the lines. You notice those? Those are formed by sheep that walk them. And as a shepherd makes his way across that hillside, calling a sheep, they will find the little tufts of grass that we talked about last week, and they'll eat. But they need to make sure they're following his voice, so they're going in the right direction. Sometimes we don't want to go the Lord's direction. I know there have been times in my life I sure didn't. And I want to go my own route. I want to choose my own path. And then whenever I do that, inevitably I find myself off the narrow path, not following the Lord, going the wrong direction. And that's when we find ourselves in trouble. That's when we get into a situation where we're crying out to the Lord. Nowadays, we have help leading us in the direction we should go. We have these GPS. I have one on my phone. I use it regularly. Being new around here, it's been a huge help. And these are great because they know exactly where you are. You just feed where you want to go, and it leads you step by step. Turn here, and it leads you right there. I want you to imagine that you and I are on our way to Chicago, and maybe somebody in our church is in need, and they're at a Chicago hospital, and so we're making our way to Chicago. And I'm driving, and we're having a good time, and we're just talking. My GPS is telling me where to turn. And then all of a sudden, it says, take the next exit, 127 north, to Chicago. But for some reason, I take the other exit, and I go south, away from Chicago. Now, what are you going to do? You're probably going to say, Vern, you missed the turn here, or we're going the wrong direction. And how would you feel if I said to you, yeah, you know, I like these GPS. They're real handy, and they're a great tool to try to help you. But you know what? I got my own way to Chicago. You would be very concerned at that point. You'd be thinking, does he take medicine and didn't take it this morning? You know, what's going on? You'd be getting your phone out, and it'd be a little scary, wouldn't it? Well, man has created this amazing tool, a GPS, to meet our directional needs. And it's great, it's wonderful, but I want you to consider that there is one greater, the one who created man himself, the Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ. Colossians chapter 1, John chapter 1 teaches us that he is the creator of all things. There's nothing made that he didn't make himself. And he created the universe. He measures it with the breadth of his hand. And he knows where you are, he knows where you need to go, and he knows everything you need along the way. Verse 3 here says, he guides me. Make sure you're following the Good Shepherd. And how many times do we ignore him? We know what he wants us to do, and we turn and do something different. We do what we want. And you know, honestly, when that happens, we're going the opposite direction, it should scare us. If we're not following the Good Shepherd, it should scare us. Verse 3 continues, he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And he's not going to lead you the wrong way. He's the Good Shepherd. He's the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus isn't going to lead you the wrong way. He takes you down the right paths. Jesus is the Good Shepherd. And he stakes his name on it. What does it say there? Leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. You know what the name of Jesus means? The name means God saves. His name declares what he wants to do for us. He's not going to lead you down the wrong path. He's not going to take you somewhere you shouldn't be. He loves you. He's going to protect you. He's going to provide for you. He's going to save you. His credibility is on the line. I'm not going to ruin his good name. So he leads us down the right paths. And when we go down the wrong paths, he grabs a hold of us. He disciplines us. We're his sheep. And if we're his sheep, we carry his name. We bear his name. So let me ask you, are you on the paths of righteousness? As you come in here today, as you gather to worship with the church, are you on the paths of righteousness? Are you following the voice of the Good Shepherd? If you are, he'll meet your spiritual needs. He'll meet your directional needs. But we also see here that he'll meet our emotional needs. Our emotional needs. Verse 4, he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Fear. Boy, fear can get the best of us. I know it has me in the past. Fear of losing your job. You lose your job, you don't have money, you can't pay the bills, you lose the house. And then fear grips us, right? Fear that people won't like us. Fear that we'll fail, and so we stay back and we don't apply ourselves. The valley of the shadow of death is a valley filled with fears. Are you in that valley? Maybe there's some of us in our church right now that they're in the valley of the shadow of death. They're experiencing hard times. They're dealing with loss or they're dealing with sickness. I want to encourage you this morning, if you're in the valley, remember. We like the mountaintops, don't we? That's where we want to live. We want the nice mountain view. We want to be able to see all of the terrain around. We like the mountaintops. But you wouldn't have mountains unless you had valleys. And when you have those valleys and it's hard and it's difficult, you don't know what to do, I want to encourage you this morning, if you're in the valley, remember that if you're in the valley, that means another mountain is coming. That there are mountains all around us, and if you're in the valley, there's a mountain coming. So don't lose heart. Don't quit. Don't stop. Don't allow fear to paralyze you. Definitely don't set up residence in the valley. We have a tendency sometimes we want to do this. We make ourselves at home in the valley. Don't do that. Valleys are temporary. Mountains are coming. Just keep following the shepherd, and he'll lead you safely through the valley. He knows the way. He is the way. Notice the verse says, the valley is filled with shadows. You know, when the sun sets and you're in the valley, not only do you have the shadows of the mountain, but then you have the darkness that comes from the sky, and it gets dark in the valley faster than normal. And when you're a sheep, all of a sudden, you don't even notice the shepherd anymore. All you notice is the darkness that's crouching in. And you get real afraid really quick. And it's no fun. And all of a sudden, you feel like you're all alone, and fear grips you. Focus on the shepherd, not on the darkness. David says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. You are with me. Listen, you might feel like you're alone, but you're not alone. If you're in the valley and you're the shepherd's sheep, then he's with you. Just listen. Listen for his voice and then follow after his voice. He has the voice of truth. Focus on the good shepherd when you're in the shadow. David says, you are with me. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. The rod is a club. And every shepherd had one. He had it to beat back predators that would come after the sheep. The predator had enough nerve to come out with him there. He would grip that rod out and he would take care of that predator. He also had a staff, a shepherd's crook. You've seen these before. And he would use that when a sheep would find its way in a thicket and couldn't get out. He would reach down and grab it and pull it right out by the neck. So in one hand, he has the rod of power. In the other hand, he has the staff of grace, power and grace. And when you're in a dark valley, remember the shepherd has the power and the staff of grace to meet your spiritual needs, to meet your directional needs, to meet your emotional needs. But we have to follow after him. There's another need he'll meet for us, our physical needs. Verse 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. An enemy is anything that'll threaten your security. And when a sheep gets lost, gets off the path, wanders away, the shepherd must find that sheep very quickly. You know why? Because that sheep will be either a wolf or a coyote's dinner that evening. It will. And so when a shepherd finds him, often he'll find the sheep hungry. And so he'll take a little piece of cloth that he's got around and he'll put it down on the ground, and it has feed in it. And the shepherd has a table laid before him in the presence of his enemies that are watching. And they're watching that sheep eat, and they can do nothing. Why? Because the shepherd's there. And the sheep enjoys the food with the shepherd, even in the presence of the enemies. And when we're with the shepherd, he's all we need. This isn't just church talk. This is the spiritual reality that God has designed. When we're with him, when we know him, when we're following after him, he meets all our needs. It begins and it ends with him. I love the illustration that Tony Evans gave. He says that he is the source and everything else is the resource. He is the source and everything else is the resource. I think it's a great way to look at it. There's only one source. There's lots of resources. And sometimes we get resources confused with the source, you know. God is the source. Jesus is the creator of everything. Nothing was made apart from him. He's the source. He is God in the flesh. It's not our job. Our job's not the source. The government's not the source. No, God's the source. And everything else is a resource. And if the resource shuts down, guess what? God, who is the source, can open up a new resource for us. Something else in your life is your leader, your source. If you're not following the good shepherd, then the Lord's not your shepherd. And if the Lord's not your shepherd, you're not going to find all that you need. So follow him. He's the source. When I was a kid, we had a little Chihuahua. His name was Chico. And we would take really good care of him. We'd feed him. He had always his little bowl always had water in it. His dish always had food in it. And we played with him. He'd sleep with us up in the bed at night. Love little Chico. Chico, he just had the life. He really did. And from time to time, Mom, she would make dinner, and she'd have a little leftover gravy. Maybe you guys do this. And they'd get the little bowl of food, and she'd pour the gravy on top of it. And of course, you didn't have to call him. He was right there. Yeah. And it's incredible how that little teeny dog can engulf a plate of food, right? And man, we would watch him just inhale this food, but we had to be careful because we might be a little too close, and Chico would be going, you know, is he? And see, little Chico, he had gotten confused at those moments. He'd get confused, and he got so used to all of his needs being provided for that he forgot where the food he ate came from. And that was us. He's looking at us. Who gave him the food? He acted like that food was his. It's all my food. I got this food. It's my food. And his growl warned us to stay away from his food. What had happened? His resources and his sources got confused. And we can do that. God owns it all. He's the source. And we don't want to put our trust in the resource. It's just a resource. He's the shepherd. And if he's yours, he'll be your source. He will. Verse 5 continues, you anoint my head with oil. Author and shepherd Philip Keller, he explains that gnats and mosquitoes and flies, they can just consume a flock of sheep. And they just hang around their face, and the sheep react, and some of them will stomp their feet out of frustration. Others will try to outrun. They'll run in circles trying to outrun the bugs that are following them. There have been sheep they have caught banging their head against rocks because the gnats are all around. And they need relief. And oftentimes shepherds will have a special mixture of oil, and he'll go and he'll pour it on the sheep's head. And the herbs in there will chase all of the bugs away. And it's not a one-time application. It's something he has to do again and again to make sure that the bugs stay away. They're pests. You have any pests in your life? pests just get in the way and they won't let up and they cause you to run around all over the place. Maybe you just feel like banging your head up against the wall. And the only remedy for a sheep is that oil. Not only does the shepherd anoint our head with oil, it says, my cup runs over. That's a picture of blessing. He doesn't just care and provide your need. He lavishly cares. He lavishly. The cup runs over. He meets our spiritual needs. He meets our directional needs. He meets our emotional needs. He meets our physical needs. And the greatest need of all is he meets our eternal needs. Look at verse 6. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord all night long. Is that what it says? All night long, all night. I will dwell in the house of the Lord for a season. Is that what it says? What does it say? It says, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And notice it says, surely. Surely. It's not possibly, not hopefully, not maybe, surely. When you're following the Good Shepherd, it's a sure thing. And his goodness and his love will follow you all the days of your life. And when your life is over, when it's time for you to go meet your Maker, he's got that covered too. Surely I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And if he's your shepherd, he'll meet your needs. All according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. That's what Philippians says. What else is there when God's got forever taken care of? If the Lord is your shepherd, you shall not want. Question is he your shepherd? This metaphor of the sheep and the shepherd, it's a metaphor for the relationship we are to have as disciples following after Jesus. Jesus is a game changer. He changed the world. He still is after 2,000 years. And he wants us to be game changers too. But that can only happen in your family, at your school, at your work. It can only happen when you are a follower of his, when you're working to be like him, when he's your good shepherd. In Psalm 23, it's a detailed account of how God provides so many needs. It's a detailed account of what being a sheep to the shepherd looks like. And he's so serious about this. He's so serious about being a shepherd that he's willing to lay his life down, and did. In fact, John chapter 10, Jesus talks about this. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus laid down his life for us to meet all of our needs, our directional need, to meet our spiritual need, our emotional need, to meet our physical need and our eternal need. He defeated sin and death to meet our needs. And he says to us, come, follow me. Be a game changer in your life to the glory and honor of Jesus Christ. So I have two questions I want you to think about. Number one, is Jesus your good shepherd? Is he? Number two, are you allowing him to meet your needs? Or are you searching and trusting elsewhere? Remember, if you're his sheep, you're following him, not going everywhere else, trying to get your needs met. Trust him today. He's calling you to. Let's bow together.